Imagine logging into your banking app, right? You just want to check your checking account balance, maybe look at your credit score. But instead, the algorithm running the whole system is actively calculating your statistical odds of being deported.
Yeah, it sounds like something out of a sci-fi novel.
Right. Or, I mean, if that doesn't grab your attention, imagine the United States government operating exactly like a Silicon Valley venture capitalist, like taking a massive direct ownership stake in a single publicly traded microchip company, betting literally billions of taxpayer dollars on its stock performance.
Which is a massive departure from how things usually work.
Exactly. I mean, this isn't dystopian fiction. It's not some theoretical economics paper. This is the literal stated blueprint of the United States economy as it's been executed over the last 12 months.
It really is. It's a fundamental rewiring of the relationship between the state, the market, and you, the individual citizen. What we are looking at is just a staggering pivot in how federal power is actually deployed.
And that is exactly what we're unpacking for you today. Welcome in. We have gathered this highly specific, frankly, massive stack of official White House releases, fact sheets, executive orders, presidential messages, all zeroing in on a very active window, basically from May 2025 through May 2026.
And it's a lot of paper.
It is a mountain of paper. Our mission here is to decode the structural impact of these executive actions on everyday Americans. We are going straight to the source material to look at the mechanical reality of these policies. Not just what they say they're doing, but what they're actually doing.
Right, and just to set the ground rules for you listening, our objective here is to look purely at the mechanics and the stated intent. We aren't here to endorse a political ideology or, play pundit.
No, absolutely not.
We're going to analyze how the administration argues they are reshaping society. We want to see who structurally benefits from these moves and whether the mechanical reality of these orders actually matches the political rhetoric. We want to know how the levers of power are actually being pulled.
Because the sheer scope of these documents is, it's staggering. We're moving from incredibly granular everyday details like the exact cash price of generic cholesterol medication or the leak repair regulations on supermarket refrigerators.
Right, very niche stuff.
Yeah, niche but impactful, all the way up to the global macroeconomic stage. So I want to start exactly where most people feel the economy the most viscerally, the checkout aisle and the pharmacy counter.
That's where it hits your wallet first.
Exactly. We have this fact sheet from May 18th, 2026, and it announces the massive expansion of a platform called TrumpRx.gov.
Yeah, the administration's framing here is that they are launching a historic initiative. They want to provide unprecedented price transparency and choice to the American consumer.
Okay.
So the May 18th fact sheet details that this site now features more than 600 generic medications. We are talking about the absolute staples of the American medicine cabinet.
Right, like the stuff people take every single day.
Exactly. Atorvastatin for cholesterol, clopidogrel, which is a heavily prescribed blood thinner, lisinopril for high blood pressure, and metformin for diabetes management.
But it's the mechanism of this that I find fascinating. Because the stated goal here is to completely bypass the insurance middlemen. The site integrates discount programs from private companies. They specifically name Amazon Pharmacy, Cost Plus Drugs, and GoodRx.
The big disruptors in the space.
Right. And they want consumers to compare the direct cash price of these generic drugs against whatever copay their health insurance company is demanding. So the government is basically saying, well, we can't legislate the insurance system into submission, so we're just going to build a comparison shopping site. And we'll just hope Amazon and GoodRx fight it out to lower prices.
That is essentially the strategy, yeah.
Yeah.
We can call it transparency as regulation. But to understand why they're doing this, you kind of have to look at the mechanics of how drug pricing actually works in the United States.
Which is a nightmare.
It is a completely opaque black box. You have these entities called pharmacy benefit managers, or PBMs. They act as the middlemen between the drug manufacturers, the pharmacies, and your insurance provider.
Okay, so they're the go-between.
Right. And they negotiate these secret rebates.
Yeah.
And often, the copay you are charged through your insurance is actually higher than what the drug costs to manufacture.
Oh, wait, really? Hold on. So my insurance company could be charging me like a $15 copay for a generic blood pressure pill that only costs $2 to make.
Precisely. It's a known industry practice called a clawback.
A clawback.
Yeah. The pharmacy collects your $15, they keep a couple of bucks, and they send the rest back to the PBM.
Is wild.
It is. So by forcing a centralized federal marketplace comparison for cash prices, the administration is trying to break that model entirely. They're trying to stimulate raw, free market competition directly at the consumer level.
Because if you see it's cheaper in cash, you just ignore your insurance.
Exactly. If Amazon Pharmacy is publicly listing that same blood pressure medication for $4 in cash on a federal website, the consumer realizes their insurance is ripping them off.
Okay, so it's basically like Expedia or Kayak, but for life-saving medications. You log on, you see who has the cheapest generic blood thinner, and you bypass the travel agent entirely.
That's a really good analogy.
But hold on, let's look at the actual effect here. If the solution to drug prices is forcing consumers to shop around, doesn't this assume the average American has the time, the energy, and the medical literacy to navigate a totally fragmented cash discount market?
It does make a lot of assumptions about the consumer.
Right. Like, if my grandfather needs 5 different medications, are we really expecting him to buy 3 from Amazon, 1 from GoodRx, and 1 through his Medicare plan just to piece together affordable health care? That seems incredibly burdensome.
And that right there is the exact structural vulnerability of this policy. Transparency requires an active, highly engaged consumer base to actually shift the market. If people don't use the tool, the prices don't change.
So it's basically putting the homework on the sick person.
Well, the administration's bet, according to the documents anyway, is that the mere threat of this massive, visible comparison will be enough. They think just having this site out there will force insurance companies and PBMs to lower their prices across the board just to avoid losing their market share.
Oh, I see. So it's a deterrence thing.
Right. They explicitly state that the site will drive greater cash price competition among the nation's largest pharmacy discount companies. So they want the corporations to sweat.
Okay. But generic drugs are only half the battle. I mean, generics are pretty cheap to begin with. What about the branded medications that cost like thousands of dollars a month? Because the fact sheet mentions that generic prices are listed separately from high-cost branded medications, and those are negotiated under what they call their most favored nation agreements.
Yes.
And this is where the free market ideology they just championed completely flips on its head.
It really does. The most favored nation pricing initiative is central to their argument of putting American patients first. The administration details a series of actions stemming from an executive order that was issued back in May 2025.
Okay, what's the logic there?
The underlying logic is basically a grievance. They argue that American consumers pay extortionate prices for branded drugs in order to subsidize the research and development that allows other, socialized nations to pay rock-bottom prices.
So we foot the bill so Europe gets cheap drugs. That's the argument.
Exactly. That's their stance.
But their solution to this isn't just to cap prices here at home, because they point to this specific agreement from December 2025 with the United Kingdom. And the U.S. Trade Representative, the Department of Commerce, and Health and Human Services announced a deal that actively increases the net price of new prescription drugs by 25% in the UK. I literally had to read that sentence 3 times. They didn't just lower our prices, they used federal trade leverage to force another sovereign nation's healthcare system to pay more.
It is an incredibly aggressive deployment of state power. Rather than letting the free market dictate the bloated price of a pharmaceutical, the administration is heavily intervening. They are essentially saying to foreign governments, look, if you want access to the broader American economic market, you have to pay your fair share for innovative medicines.
Wow.
And they claim this brings global pricing structures into alignment, which subsequently allows pharmaceutical companies to lower the burden on American consumers.
But mechanically, let's think about who actually benefits here. Does forcing the UK's National Health Service to pay 25% more for a cancer drug actually force Pfizer or Moderna to lower the price in Ohio?
That is the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it?
Right, because structurally, unless there is a simultaneous domestic price cap, which totally goes against their deregulatory vibe, there is no mechanical guarantee that the drug companies will pass those newly captured foreign revenues down to the American consumer.
No guarantee whatsoever.
They could just book record profits globally. The immediate verifiable beneficiary is just the pharmaceutical manufacturer's bottom line.
That's a very accurate reading of the mechanics. The administration's stated intent is that aligning global prices will relieve the domestic burden. But you're right, there is a lot of deceptive wording in how that's framed as a guaranteed savings for regular folks, when mechanically the savings aren't mandated.
So they're throwing the weight of the U.S. government around to essentially act as a global collection agency for big pharma. and just doing it under the theory that the savings will trickle down to us.
It is a massive departure from the idea of just letting the free market sort it out.
Yeah, and this tension between deregulation and intervention shows up again when we look at the grocery store. We have this other fact sheet from May 21, 2026, and it's all about reversing Biden-era environmental rules.
Yes, specifically targeting the Environmental Protection Agency. The administration finalized revisions to extend compliance deadlines for the use of hydrofluorocarbons, or HFCs.
Refrigerants.
Right. And they proposed correcting rules that impose strict leak repair requirements on large-scale refrigeration systems.
Now, to the average person, rolling back leak repair requirements for industrial supermarket freezers sounds like a highly technical, obscure environmental issue. Like, who cares? But the administration draws a direct, aggressive line from that specific EPA rule to the price of milk in your fridge.
They rely on what we can call deregulatory math.
Deregulatory math. Okay, break that down for me.
So the administration argues that environmental compliance costs for supermarkets, agricultural producers, and medical supply transporters are immense. Let's say a regional grocery chain has to spend $5 million replacing its perfectly functional refrigeration systems just to comply with a new federal standard on HFCs. Where does that capital come from?
The customer.
Exactly. The administration's argument is that those costs are never eaten by corporate profits. They are passed directly and entirely to the consumer in the form of food inflation.
I mean, the logic makes sense on a basic accounting level. If the grocery store doesn't have to buy the expensive eco-friendly freezer, their operating costs stay low, and the price of eggs stays down.
That's the theory.
They explicitly claim in the May 21st document that these actions will save Americans a total of $2.4 billion, safeguard 350,000 jobs, and save supermarkets over $800 million in compliance costs.
And they pair this environmental deregulation with direct financial backing to boost the supply side of the food economy. Because the same fact sheet details a new Small Business Administration rule that doubles cumulative loan limits from $5 million to $10 million.
Oh, right, the grocery guarantee.
Yes. They branded it the Grocery Guarantee, which provides 90% federal guarantees to eligible loans aimed at expanding domestic food production.
Wait, let me look at that. A 90% federal guarantee.
Yes.
So if a massive agricultural business takes out a $10 million loan to build a new meat processing plant, and the business goes completely belly up, the taxpayer is on the hook for $9 million of it.
Mechanically, yes. It is a massive de-risking for private enterprise. And it's subsidized entirely by the federal government.
So they remove the regulatory costs on the back end by gutting the EPA rules, and they subsidize the financial risk on the front end through the SBA, all in the name of boosting food supply to lower prices.
Right.
But again, look at who structurally benefits here. The supermarket chains save $800 million. The agricultural businesses get basically risk-free capital. The consumer, I mean, maybe they see a 10-cent drop in the price of beef, but we are absolutely trading a short-term drop in grocery bills for massive long-term environmental externalities. I mean, HFCs are incredibly potent greenhouse gases.
They are. That is the fundamental trade-off here.
Yeah.
And the administration's rhetoric makes it clear that they view long-term environmental regulations as immediate economic threats.
Yeah, the language is intense.
Very. They use incredibly combative language regarding the previous administration's policies. They call them ridiculous regulations, crippling leak repair requirements, disastrous. They are framing deregulation not just as a philosophical preference, but as an emergency economic rescue mission for the American family.
Even if the real benefits skew heavily toward corporate cost savings.
Right. And they apply this exact same logic to the automotive sector in the documents, highlighting the rollback of corporate average fuel economy, or CAFE standards.
Oh, the CAFE standards rollback. Yeah, the administration claims that resetting those standards to levels that can easily be met with conventional gasoline and diesel vehicles will save American families $109 billion over 5 years.
That's the number they cite.
But isn't that math incredibly selective? I mean, sure, the upfront cost of a V8 truck might be cheaper if the manufacturer doesn't have to invest in hybrid technology. But what happens when the consumer has to pay for the gas to run a highly inefficient vehicle over the next decade? Are they actually saving money?
You're touching on the difference between capital expenditure buying the car and operating expenditure fueling the car.
Right.
The administration's $109 billion savings claim is almost certainly front-loaded. It focuses entirely on the lowered sticker price of the vehicle by removing the R&D costs of electric or high-efficiency drivetrains from the manufacturer's ledger.
So it looks good on day one.
Exactly. But it largely discounts the compounded long-term costs to the consumer at the gas pump, to say nothing of the environmental impact, which again is treated as an acceptable trade-off.
So they're essentially taking a sledgehammer to regulations here at home to unleash the domestic free market. They want the government completely out of your pharmacy choices, out of your supermarket's freezer aisle, and out of your driveway.
Domestically, yes.
But what fascinates me is that the moment you look past the United States border, that free market ideology completely vanishes. Suddenly, the government wants to micromanage everything.
It is the most striking structural paradox of the administration's economic vision. Because domestically, they champion aggressive deregulation. But internationally, they're executing a highly managed, heavily negotiated, and overtly protectionist trade strategy. They do not believe in the invisible hand of the global market.
No, they want their hands all over it. Let's get into the May 17th, 2026 fact sheet. This is the one detailing the, quote, historic deals with China. This document outlines what is supposedly the first visit of a U.S. president to China since 2017.
A major diplomatic event.
And the commitments they brought back are not broad tariff reductions. They are highly specific, managed quotas.
The document outlines a sweeping consensus reached directly with President Xi Jinping. And you are right to focus on the structure here, because the cornerstone of this agreement is the establishment of two new institutions, the U.S.-China Board of Trade and the U.S.-China Board of Investment.
Okay, what do those do?
They are designed to manage bilateral economic relationships directly at the highest levels of government.
Which effectively bypasses traditional multilateral institutions like the World Trade Organization entirely.
Exactly. It's direct state-to-state negotiation.
And the specific numbers they negotiated are wild. I mean, China approved an initial purchase of 200 American-made Boeing aircraft. The fact sheet notes this is China's first commitment to buy Boeing planes since 2017. They also secured a commitment from China to purchase at least $17 billion per year of U.S. agricultural products through 2028.
And it goes deeper than that.
Yeah.
Additionally, the agreement tackles deep supply chain vulnerabilities. The fact sheet states that China will explicitly address U.S. concerns regarding global shortages of rare earths and critical minerals.
Right. They specifically name yttrium, scandium, neodymium, and indium.
Yes.
For context, for everyone listening, why do we care about neodymium? What is that?
Neodymium is a rare earth metal used to make incredibly powerful, lightweight, permanent magnets. Without it, you do not have modern electric vehicle motors. You do not have advanced wind turbines. And crucially, you do not have the guidance systems for military cruise missiles or the sensors in F-35 fighter jets.
Oh, wow. So it's essential.
Completely essential. And China currently dominates the global processing of these minerals. So by securing a guaranteed quota of these materials, the administration is treating trade as a matter of hard national security, not just economic efficiency.
But look at the mechanics of this. They're sitting at a table with a foreign adversary and negotiating exact quotas. Buy exactly 200 of our planes. Buy exactly $17 billion of our soy and beef. Guarantee us this exact tonnage of neodymium.
It's very prescriptive.
Yeah. That is not free market capitalism. That is two heavily armed governments acting as central planners, deciding the flow of billions of dollars of commerce by fiat.
And the administration is completely unapologetic about this ideological shift. If you look at the president's message on World Trade Week, which was dated May 19, 2026, the rhetoric is incredibly stark.
I was reading that. It's intense.
The document states that for decades, quote, gutless politicians handed away our prosperity in the name of free trade. They claim this traditional approach hollowed out American factory towns, shuttered mills, and weakened vital supply chains.
I actually have the quote right here. They state that freer markets never became fairer ones. That is a massive earthquake-level departure from traditional American economic orthodoxy.
It really is.
For 50 years, the prevailing wisdom from both political parties was that free trade, open global markets, and lowering tariffs were the ultimate goals of American economic policy. And the administration is openly rejecting that. They are championing what they call strategic tariffs.
They are completely redefining the objective of trade. For previous administrations, the goal was a frictionless global market where goods are produced wherever it is cheapest. For this administration, the goal is reciprocity and the deliberate protection of domestic industry, even if it requires imposing higher costs on consumers via tariffs.
Even if it hurts regular Americans at the cash register.
Right. They argue it protects their jobs in the long run. They claim this heavy-handed approach has secured over 20 new trade deals, including a massive new agreement with the European Union, and brought critical production back to U.S. shores.
And they back up these claims of economic success by pointing directly to the stock market. We have a release from May 18th, 2026, where the administration touts these massive milestones. 57 record highs for the S&P 500, 50 records for the Nasdaq, and the Dow Jones closing above 50,000 for the first time in history.
Huge numbers.
But buried within that same release is a piece of information that honestly made me stop reading and just stare at the page. It's regarding the Intel deal.
Ah, yes, the Intel equity stake. It is arguably the most radical economic maneuver detailed in this entire stack of documents.
It's nuts. The release states in plain language that the United States government secured a 10% equity stake in Intel Corporation in August of 2025. It says that in just 8 months, this position surged in value by 496.5% to more than $50 billion.
A massive gain.
And they frame this massive return as a direct windfall for American taxpayers.
But mechanically, how does this actually happen? Does the U.S. Treasury Department just open a massive Robinhood account and start buying up tech stocks?
No, not quite like that. The precise mechanics are usually tied to federal grant and loan programs, similar to the HB and Science Act or the Defense Production Act.
Okay.
When the government provides massive subsidies to a company to build a semiconductor fabrication plant, what they call a fab on U.S. soil, they can attach warrants to that funding. Warrants give the government the right to purchase equity at a specific price.
Oh, I see. So if the company's value explodes, the government exercises those warrants. We saw a similar mechanism during the 2008 financial crisis with the auto industry bailouts.
Right, but 2008 was a triage situation. The auto industry was collapsing, and the government stepped in to stop a total depression. This isn't a bailout. This is framed as a proactive, strategic investment. The government is acting like a venture capitalist, placing a bet on a strategic industry.
Exactly.
And if you pay taxes, you are essentially now a shareholder in Intel, which sounds amazing when the stock is up 500%. But if that company makes a bad bet on AI architecture tomorrow, or if a competitor completely disrupts them, it's your taxpayer money catching the falling knife.
That is the inherent, unavoidable risk of state capitalism. When the state becomes an investor, the traditional boundaries blur entirely. Think about the structural implications here.
Like what?
Well, if the government owns 10% of Intel, how does that impact federal contracting? When the Department of Defense needs to purchase billions of dollars in advanced microchips, are they objectively evaluating all vendors on the open market? Or are they heavily incentivized to buy from the specific company that the Treasury owns a massive piece of?
Exactly. It creates an immediate, massive conflict of interest. And what about antitrust regulations? If Intel's competitors, say AMD or NVIDIA, raise legitimate concerns about monopoly behavior or unfair market practices, the federal regulators at the FTC or the Justice Department are essentially investigating a company that the federal government itself is heavily invested in.
It gets very messy.
You cannot be the referee of the game if you own the biggest team on the field.
Yet the administration's argument, according to the document, kind of brushes past those theoretical concerns. They state that this deal demonstrates that decisive action, smart trade policy, and prioritizing American workers and innovation are rebuilding national strength.
Well, they just point to the scoreboard.
Right. They are pointing to that $50 billion paper gain as absolute proof that their America First agenda works. They are prioritizing the strategic geopolitical outcome, which is securing a domestic semiconductor supply chain to compete with China over traditional free market purism or regulatory neutrality.
It is a fascinating evolution. We go from worrying about the cash price of a generic blood thinner to the government directly owning a chunk of the microchip industry. Which brings us to the next major shift. Because the administration isn't just changing how we trade physical goods, they are attempting to fundamentally rewire the digital plumbing of the financial system itself.
Yes, the financial plumbing.
We have an executive order dated May 19th, 2026, aimed at integrating financial technology or fintech innovation into regulatory frameworks.
And here we see another striking example of the dual-track approach. This order directs federal regulators to aggressively streamline processes for fintech firms. Crucially, it asks the Federal Reserve to evaluate expanding direct access to reserve bank payment accounts for non-bank fintechs and uninsured depository institutions.
Let me try to break down what that means mechanically, because it sounds incredibly dry, but it's actually revolutionary. Right now, the Federal Reserve is essentially the bank for banks.
Correct.
Only heavily regulated traditional brick-and-mortar banks have direct access to the Fed's payment systems to move money around instantly. Fintech firms like the app on your phone that lets you instantly send 20 bucks to a friend or buy a fraction of a cryptocurrency, they usually have to partner with a traditional bank to actually access those underlying rails.
And those traditional banks charge a toll for that access. It's a gatekeeping mechanism. They hold the keys.
Right. So right now, traditional banks own the toll roads, and fintechs have to pay a fee every single time they want to drive a transaction through. This new executive order is essentially giving the fintech companies their own federal EZ pass to bypass the traditional banks entirely.
That is a perfect mechanical analogy, the EZ pass. The administration's stated rationale is that the current rules governing access to these central payment services unfairly favor incumbents at the expense of innovators.
Meaning the old banks.
Yes. They argue that traditional financial regulations are cumbersome relics of a brick-and-mortar age that stifled digital growth. By potentially giving fintechs direct access to the Federal Reserve, they are trying to cut out the traditional banking middlemen, lower transaction costs, and drive explosive innovation in the digital asset space.
And the fact sheet lists several prior actions to prove they're deeply committed to making America the financial innovation capital of the world. They specifically mention ending Operation Choke Point 2.0, which was a previous effort to deny standard banking services to the digital assets and crypto industry.
A big win for crypto.
Massive. They also highlight establishing a strategic Bitcoin reserve in March 2025 and signing the Genius Act to lead the global digital currency revolution.
The through line here is undeniable. They are throwing the doors wide open for cryptocurrency and digital financial technology. They are arguing that sweeping deregulation in this specific sector is essential for global competitiveness. They want capital to move at the speed of light.
Right, deregulate the money. But then, on the exact same day, literally May 19th, 2026, they issue another executive order titled Restoring Integrity to America's Financial System. And this order takes a completely contradictory, incredibly heavy-handed, highly aggressive regulatory approach to traditional banks, specifically regarding immigration status.
This is where the structural friction becomes unavoidable. While the fintech order is entirely about removing barriers and speeding up transactions, the integrity order is about erecting massive new checkpoints based on national security and immigration status.
Checkpoints at the bank.
Yes. The order directs the Treasury Secretary to flag suspicious activity tied to payroll tax evasion, off-the-books wage payments, and the use of ITIN's individual taxpayer identification numbers by individuals attempting to open accounts without a verified legal presence.
And they use some terrifying numbers to justify this crackdown. The fact sheet claims that current gaps in customer identification have allowed Chinese money laundering networks to use U.S. accounts to launder over $312 billion for criminal organizations, including financing human trafficking.
Huge numbers.
They also mention uncovering illicit fentanyl-related financial activity tied directly to Mexican cartels.
Now, monitoring the banking system for international money laundering and cartel activity is a completely standard, traditional federal role. No one disputes the necessity of that. But where this order introduces a novel and honestly legally questionable structural change is in the domestic consumer credit market.
Yes, this part is wild.
The order explicitly directs the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB, to consider modifying what are known as ability to repay standards.
This is the part that completely blew my mind. They are essentially asking the CFPB to require local banks to factor in the statistical risk of deportation and lost wages when extending mortgages, auto loans, and basic credit cards to undocumented immigrants.
The administration's stated economic rationale is that extending credit to populations facing potential removal creates structural credit risks within the banking system. They argue that employers of illegal aliens frequently evade payroll taxes, which distorts the income data used for underwriting. Furthermore, they argue that when an undocumented borrower suddenly loses their wages due to federal immigration enforcement, they inevitably default on the loan.
And the fact sheet goes further, arguing that when banks are forced to absorb these elevated default risks, the costs don't just disappear. They are passed on to American consumers in the form of higher fees, stricter lending requirements, and higher interest rates.
The same logic they use for the supermarkets.
Right. So by forcing banks to tighten underwriting specifically against undocumented immigrants, the administration claims they are protecting the wallets of law-abiding Americans.
It is a highly complex economic argument that seeks to use financial regulation as a proxy enforcement mechanism for immigration policy.
But practically speaking, mechanically, how does that actually work? If a bank loan officer in Texas now has to calculate the statistical likelihood of an ICE deportation rate when writing a 60-month auto loan for a construction worker, aren't we asking banking clerks to do the job of immigration judges? How does a bank actually price the risk of an impending federal enforcement action into an interest rate?
The reality is they can't. It is an impossible compliance burden for a financial institution to accurately model. The order asks regulators to issue guidance on managing these risks, but the mechanical reality is that it will simply price undocumented immigrants out of the formal credit market entirely.
Because it's too much of a hassle for the bank.
Exactly. If a bank cannot accurately price the risk of deportation, their compliance departments will simply mandate a blanket denial for anyone applying with an ITN instead of a Social Security number.
Which means you are just pushing millions of people out of the regulated banking system and into the shadow banking system.
Yeah.
Payday lenders, loan sharks, cash-only transactions. And wait, forcing banks to act as immigration enforcement completely contradicts their push to deregulate fintech.
It seems like it, yeah.
It sounds like the administration only likes financial deregulation when it serves digital innovation and crypto billionaires. But they are perfectly happy to drown traditional banks in massive regulatory red tape if it serves their border security agenda. Is that the trade-off here?
You're seeing a friction point, but to the administration, it's not a contradiction. It is a hierarchy of priorities. It reflects a worldview where capital should move freely and innovatively for legal citizens and emerging technology, but the financial system must be strictly and aggressively gatekept to prevent unauthorized populations from participating in the domestic economy. They view the financial system as a tool of statecraft.
Okay, so we've covered the pharmacy counter, the grocery store, the global supply chain, the stock market, the Federal Reserve, and the border. We have seen how the money moves, but policy isn't just about money.
No, it rarely is.
It's about narrative. It's about the story a country tells about itself. Moving from the hard numbers of the financial system, let's look at how the administration is attempting to reshape the social fabric and national identity.
That narrative is heavily featured in First Lady Melania Trump's remarks regarding the Fostering the Future Act. We have detailed documents from May 19 and 20, 2026, covering her speeches at the congressional picnic and the Senate spouses luncheon.
She announces that the House unanimously passed the Fostering the Future Act, and she is using her platform to push the Senate to bring it across the finish line. She outlines her initiative, which is built on 4 very distinct community-centric pillars for foster care.
Those 4 pillars, as detailed in the source material, are education, love, career ambition, and resilience. She argues that children aging out of the foster care system need an unmovable foundation built on tangible knowledge.
Right.
She emphasizes that the physical structure of a group home or a house is not enough. They need the warmth of a family to truly know they are loved.
And I thought the third pillar, career ambition, was particularly revealing in how it ties the social safety net back into the administration's broader economic themes. She states that when these individuals secure an entry-level job, they can become financially independent, avoid the trap of homelessness, and perhaps become the next great business visionary.
It's a very specific framing.
It is. She isn't just asking for more federal funding. She explicitly connects their personal, individual success to creating new jobs and raising the community's overall economic worth.
It is an approach to social welfare that heavily emphasizes community intervention, private enterprise, and personal resilience alongside federal legislation. The administration relies heavily on the rhetoric of profound optimism and social repair. They want the listener to view this not just as bureaucratic legislation, but as a moral imperative.
Yeah, she highlights specific stories.
She specifically highlights 2 youths, Jaden Martinez and Jocelyn Fetting, who shared their personal stories of overcoming the system on Capitol Hill. The First Lady calls them living proof that the American dream is within reach for all.
But the administration also uses this theme of repair in a much more literal, physical sense to drive a deeply political narrative. This brings us to a release from May 19, 2026, titled, "Decline is a Choice. President Trump Restores Pride and Beauty to America's Capital."
This document details the physical restoration of the historic cascading fountain at Meridian Hill Park in Washington, D.C. The administration notes that for years, this specific fountain was allowed to decay, marred by graffiti, stagnant water, and crumbling infrastructure.
It was an eyesore.
Right. The release features visceral, highly aesthetic imagery of this restoration, contrasting the neglect of the past with the flowing water of the present.
But the language they use to describe fixing a municipal park fountain is absolutely sweeping. It's almost operatic. They say this is about far more than water and landscaping. It's about rekindling national pride in the city that represents the American Republic.
It's very symbolic.
They explicitly frame the broken fountain as a symbol of a bureaucratic acceptance of decline as inevitable.
And they frame the repair as an aggressive rejection of mediocrity. The document states, decline is a choice. President Trump is choosing action, beauty, strength, and pride. This is a classic, deeply effective example of intertwining physical infrastructure with a broader narrative of national exceptionalism.
By fixing the fountain, you fix the country.
By fixing the visible aesthetic rot in the capital city, they are claiming to fix the spiritual rot of the nation.
It's fascinating how they frame federal policy almost like a home renovation show. Whether it's fixing a leaky fountain in D.C. or restructuring the massive foster care system, the language is entirely about restoring a lost golden age and aggressively rejecting the idea that America is a nation in decline.
That specific phrase, a new golden age, is a recurring motif. It appears explicitly in a presidential message celebrating the 94th anniversary of Amelia Earhart's 1932 solo transatlantic flight.
Oh, I saw that.
The administration draws a direct, unbroken line from Earhart's bravery and ingenuity, battling an engine erupting in fire to cross the ocean, to their current technological pushes.
Right. The message states that under the president's leadership, they are paving the way for a new golden age of air travel, championing supersonic flight and advanced aircraft manufacturing. They are taking the historical resolve of universally beloved pioneers like Earhart and mapping it directly onto their current, highly specific policy agenda, stating that the nation is defying the limits of what is possible every single day.
We see a similar historical framing in the mention of Cuban Independence Day, where the administration stands in solidarity with Cuban Americans who fought for a constitutional way of life. Again, projecting confidence toward a new golden age for the island and its people.
Tying it all together.
The administration consistently uses these historical milestones to anchor their contemporary political movement in the broader, sweeping continuum of American exceptionalism.
So what does this all mean when we put the pieces together? Because if we take a step back and look at this entire massive stack of documents from May 2025 to May 2026, a very distinct, incredibly complex, and occasionally contradictory blueprint emerges.
It's a lot to process.
It really is. We've seen how the administration utilizes executive authority to aggressively pursue deregulation domestically. They want to strip away EPA rules on refrigerants. They want to lower fuel economy standards for automakers. They want to bypass insurance middlemen to lower the immediate out-of-pocket costs of food and drugs for the consumer.
Yet simultaneously, they are executing heavy-handed, unprecedented state interventions that would make traditional Milton Friedman-style free market economists break out in a cold sweat.
Truly.
They are weaponizing trade leverage to force foreign healthcare systems to pay more for drugs. They are investing billions of taxpayer dollars directly into private companies like Intel. They are implementing massive strategic quotas with China, managing global trade directly from the Oval Office. And they are mandating that traditional local banks act as immigration checkpoints to mitigate structural credit risks.
It is a fascinating, volatile hybrid. They are essentially saying, we want the government completely out of your grocery store and your pharmacy choices, but we demand that the government be deeply, fundamentally embedded in your international trade, your high-tech supply chains, and your loan underwriting.
It is a complete rejection of both pure laissez-faire capitalism and traditional progressive regulation. It is an economic and social philosophy built entirely around national outcomes rather than theoretical purity. If a free market achieves the desired national goal, they deregulate. If massive state intervention achieves the goal, they intervene without hesitation.
Which leaves us with a truly provocative reality to consider as we wrap up our analysis of these sources. We are witnessing an incredible real-time tension between free market capitalism and state capitalism.
We are.
If the U.S. government continues to act like a venture capitalist, taking direct, massive equity stakes in private corporations like Intel in order to compete globally with state-managed economies like China, how will that blur the traditional American line between the regulator and the regulated?
If the government is both the referee enforcing the rules of the market and a heavily invested player profiting directly from that same market, it raises profound structural questions about market competition, objective antitrust enforcement, and the future of American innovation. Will this dual role fundamentally change the nature of the American economy?
It's a question that won't be answered by a single executive order or a fact sheet, but it is clearly the reality we are all navigating right now. The blueprint is messy, the mechanisms are complex, and the structural implications for everyday Americans are massive. Thank you for joining us as we unpack this landscape. Keep analyzing the blueprint.